Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the seminar on assessment peer review. I am pleasantly surprised by how full this room is. When Don and Deborah pitched this idea to me a few months ago, I thought this sounded great, and we'd probably get a few people to show up. I did not expect almost every state to send people and have close to 200 people in this room for the next 2 days. I will say that the only thing better than one day talking about assessment peer review is 2 days talking about assessment peer review. So, especially August in DC, we've got everything going for us. So I know there's nothing going on in states, there's nothing going on with assessments, with all of you back going on in your homes. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come here and be with us today. My name is Patrick Rooney. I am the Deputy Director in the Office of State Support, which is the office responsible for overseeing, among other things, Title I and all the assessment and accountability requirements. So it comes to our office to help administer all of the assessments and the assessment peer review process. I'm just going to say a few words, and I'm going to turn it over to our assessment brain team of Don Peasley and Deborah Spitz, who have been doing a ton of work to get ready for this. So I want to thank them for all their time and effort to get this started. I want to thank you all for being here. I thought I'd start with just a show of hands. How many of you are from state agencies? All right, that's a huge number. Keep your hands up if you are from the assessment team in your state. And then I think we probably have some people here from the Title III or the ELP team, if that's different from the assessment team. And then among all state people, I think I was curious to see how many of you are new to your role within the last, say, 3 years. Yeah, a really large number, which I think is another reason that we thought this was a really great idea. You know, we relaunched the peer review in 2015, and then ESSA passed in December of 2015, and we relaunched the peer review in 2016. The process is not that different from the process it used to be under NCLB from 2002 to 2010 or so before we paused it. But I think for a lot of you, this is a new process, and what you've been going through the last 2 years submitting for peer review is probably a new experience. So we thought this was a great opportunity to come through now that we've been through 2 years and a couple cycles of doing peer review. How many of you are with assessment vendors? All right, it's good to see a lot of you here. Thank you guys for coming. I know you do a lot of work to help support your states, and we really appreciate that. How many people are here from a comp center? It's a point of reference to Deb and Andy. They are doing a project with us that we really appreciate. We're going to talk about a bit later that I think will be really helpful for the field, and we really want to use this as an opportunity for you to talk to them and give them advice on how to make that project really powerful and helpful for you in the states for what you guys are doing. So I know they're going to come up and talk about it a bit later to explain it and then ask for your input. So really, please seek out Andy and Deb at some point over the next 2 days if you've got advice or ideas for them. And then how many of my colleagues from the department are here? They're kind of sprinkled throughout. You're going to see some of them throughout the day. And some who aren't here will be coming later. And then last, how many of you have served as a peer reviewer for us for the assessment peer review at some point in the last few years? All right. Hopefully you recognize a lot of the people have their hands up. A lot of you have been in states or been working in assessments for a long time. We really appreciate all your help and support, as we could not do the assessment review process without the experts like yourselves in the field, and a lot of you aren't here to make sure that we are getting good advice and recommendations for how to look at the quality of state assessments. I'm really looking forward to today and tomorrow, because I expect that I'm going to learn a lot from all of you, both the panels and also you guys all in the field with the work you're doing. So I am really looking forward to being part of the audience and learning a lot from all of you. So I really want to, again, thank you all for taking time out of your really busy schedules to be here. We think this is a really important activity. Assessments in general and the peer review process we think is helpful and supportive to the work you're doing. But we also know that assessments are a really important part of state systems. The data from your assessments really makes a big difference for how you in the field and the schools and districts are evaluating the progress that everyone is making, where you're finding where kids need extra resources, where to provide resources, how to think about how to distribute your limited resources that you have. The assessment data provides an objective measure consistent across states that can really be helpful tool for teachers and parents and schools and communities to think about how to make sure they're helping kids reach their maximum potential. So, the work that you're doing to make sure you've got good, solid assessment systems in place is so important, and we really appreciate that. It's really a foundational piece for everything that's going on in the educational system. So again, I just want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank you all for your time and energy and spending the next 2 days with us talking about assessments. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Don Peasley and Deborah Spitz.
So just bear with me while I get my... Most of you who know me know that I almost never write anything down. And so I usually just kind of speak from a slide. But there are really important details that I'm supposed to share with everyone, and I won't remember them. So I'm going to refer to them. Number one, we do understand that the hotel's atmospheric conditions system is a little challenged right now, and we've shared that concern that this apparently the system is catching up, but I see people fanning themselves. I will tell you that this is a marked improvement from about 2 hours ago when I was here. So it was worse, if you can believe that. Not that that's reassuring, but I do think the system is catching up. So we apologize for that, but it is something we're aware of and are asking our hotel partners to try to improve. That said, it is August 1st, and we are in Washington, D.C., so this is, yeah. So just some housekeeping announcements. You may be aware of this, but we want to make it clear for everyone. This seminar, all plenary sessions in this room, and the breakout sessions, which are going to be held on the second floor in smaller rooms, are all going to be video recorded. They are being video recorded. And at a time, probably in September, we will post archived copies of all these sessions available for folks to view for eternity, I guess. But we want to make you aware of that, and we'll share out the links once we get everything through post-production and set up and all of that. Also, all handouts, PowerPoints and so forth that will be shared or discussed will be made available for download. So we won't have a lot of printed handouts here, but they will be made available to you. So that's another thing. The list of participants who are here with us today, all of you, that list will also be posted for download. Wi-Fi is available in this room. There's a card on each table in this room that has the instructions. There's a passcode that's good for the next 2 days. It also works up in the breakout session rooms. There's complimentary power strips on tables in this room, and there will not be complimentary power available up in the breakout rooms. So if you do need to get a quick charge, this is a place where you can do that. This room is kind of held as a spare room, if you will, during our breakout sessions. This room will not be programmed specifically for anything, so this will always be. The idea is we may have some states that want to work with some of our state program officers, and so we've got little consultations that may be happening while breakouts are going on. So I think, okay, so layout. So restrooms in the lobby level, there's a set of restrooms down the hall to the left and down a stairwell. That's on the lobby level. There's also restrooms available on the second floor. The second floor are located near the Pennsylvania meeting room. There are 2 elevators to the second floor. One is down this way to the left. It goes up and you come out right by the meeting rooms. There's also an elevator down here that comes up and you walk down a long hallway directly above us to a meeting room. So, and there's this set of stairs down here to take, if you have a Fitbit like I do and you keep track of steps. Another reminder, please silence your cell phone during the sessions. Mine went off yesterday. It's most embarrassing. There was a ELP session convening here yesterday. And please take a few minutes at the end of the seminar to complete an evaluation form and drop it off at the seminar registration desk. So those are some of the housekeeping things that we wanted to say. And I'm not going to repeat Patrick's welcome remarks. Not only did he take the 2 or 3 small jokes I was going to tell and use them, he took other kinds of thank you remarks. But Deborah and I do want to thank people in the States and the people who have served as our peer reviewers, because when we say we literally can't do this work without you, it's really true. So we appreciate that. So in this opening session, we're going to give an overview of what's going to happen in the next day and a half. We also wanted to kind of set a frame and a context for why we felt the need to call this seminar, what are the most significant pieces of updated information about assessment peer review that we wanted to share, and then use that as a frame to organize the rest of the sessions. Hopefully when you've looked at the session descriptions, you'll see a few themes. And so that's really, but we wanted to have this organizing opening session before we turn you loose to the real experts. So I'm Don, that's Deborah, and you've probably heard us on the phone, if nothing else, a lot in the last year and a half, 2 years. So for our agenda, we want to talk about those significant new peer review requirements under the ESSA. We want to spend some time navigating the revised guide, which we did provide a hard copy for everyone who registered. So if you didn't pick one up, it's available out on the registration table, at least till we run out of copies, but I think we have enough for everyone. We want to spend a little time, not a lot of time, but one of the topics is, when does an assessment need to be peer reviewed? Now that's something that's always been spelled out in our guide, and we think it's always been spelled out pretty clearly. Having said that, it is a question we answer a lot. So we want to revisit that again, especially in the light of new requirements under ESSA. We also want to spend a little bit of time on the critical elements in the updated guide. And then we'll provide a quick update on the status of peer review as we stand here today, what we've done in the last year and what's coming up in the next year. And then also what's coming up in terms of Title I assessment activity that you probably should be aware of from the U.S. Department of Education. So it's a little forecasting. So that's roughly what we want to spend, hopefully a little less than an hour with you. And we want to give some time to our friends at the Center for Assessments and Standards Implementation to talk about a project that we've asked them to undertake on our behalf, and they're going to be asking for your feedback, and I'll let Deb describe that at the end. So, if she throws something at me, I know I'm cutting into her time, I guess, when it gets to that, and she will too, so. So the context for our seminar is really, again, these changes in No Child Left Behind. Sorry, I'm having to navigate 2 laptops, so I need to get synced up. Okay. So our context are those new ESSA requirements. The guide reflects those new requirements. The guide, in addition to conveying professional standards for testing and measurement, which are in the center part of the critical elements, also incorporates all of the regulatory requirements under Title I for state assessment systems. So it's almost half of the critical elements are regulatory or statutory driven requirements. We want to talk about this inclusion of English language proficiency assessments under Title I now in ESSA and alternate ELP assessments, which as now part of Title I requirements, the peer review requirements apply to them. So what we've done, if you've spent a little time looking at the guide, how many people have looked at the guide before this morning? Oh, good. So you're aware that we've integrated the peer review guide so that it contains references to ELP assessments or alternate ELP assessments where it makes sense to do so. And we've tried to throw in some selected examples that are specific to ELP assessment. But there's several areas where the criteria would be the same, so we don't distinguish that. So it's interesting, when we developed a draft of the guide more than a year ago, we originally had a section A, which was pretty much the academic assessment requirements that you'd be familiar with, and then a section B, which was ELP requirements, just sort of a standalone. And we had a small panel of some experts give us feedback, and they immediately told us to integrate it, put them together and integrate them. And so then we did. Then we went through this process that someday at a happy hour I can tell you about, called our departmental clearance process. And at one point we got feedback during that, well, maybe we should pull those things apart. We did not do that. So, but it was good for a laugh at the time. So, all that being said, the other context for the seminar, since I came here 2.5 years ago and immediately started doing assessment peer review, and during that time, in interacting with states and in interacting with our peer reviewers, we had advice or desire that said, states would say, we want to have some opportunity to engage with peer reviewers so we can really hear what they're thinking. And the peer reviewers said, we want to have an opportunity to engage with people from states so that we can kind of directly offer some observations. And so, I mean, that was a constant theme of things that they said, it would be nice if the department can do that. So here we are, 2 years later. So that was probably the number one driver, was the inclusion of new assessment requirements and that need for this kind of direct technical assistance. So can't say that we'll do this every year, but we're doing it this year, and then we'll see where we end up after that. All right, do I point at the screen? It's, there we go. So a few things. I've said this already. All sessions, including breakouts, will be videotaped and posted online. Many breakout sessions are repeated. So we have a total of 5 breakout sessions with 3 topics each. So that's 15 slots. We have 9 topics total. 6 of those 9 topics will be repeated in section D and breakout session D and breakout session E, so that if you are unable, if there are 2 sessions in breakout session A that you really want to go to and can only get to 1, there's a good chance it's repeated tomorrow. So we structured it that way on purpose. So we kind of did a survey of registrants as they registered to try to figure out which sessions to repeat and which ones not. The breakout rooms will be full. I'll just tell you that. So you may not be able to get in the session that you want initially, but there's a good chance that session will be repeated. So we just want to kind of let you know about that. So one thing you learn when you work at the Department of Education, it's important to, at key points, have disclaimers about things. And so what we want to say is that we've convened a panel of about 24 people from across the country who, most of them have been assessment peer reviewers, many of them are with state education agencies, and some other folks who we think have important knowledge and perspective that they can share as experts on the topics that we've selected for this seminar. Having said that, the goal is to provide an opportunity for an exchange with their perspective. But their opinions and observations are their own. So we need to make that obvious. So obviously, we'll need your guide. You'll need your guide to refer to. It'll be like a primary source of evidence, using that term, as we're having discussions, but it tells you what our current thinking and intent is with the updated peer review. The guide was posted in June for public comment. That period's closed. We're considering some small updates, nothing. What you have in front of you will be very close to what we update. There's some corrections that we may make and a few clarifications. But there will be one more version of it with a new date, and we'll pull this one down. And so, but this is still, you can plan for your assessment peer reviews using this guide. All right? We have not developed the index templates yet, but we will do that when we post the final guide. And if you're unsure about what an index template is, see Deborah or I. We can talk about that later. Or just sort of pick it up during the examples, because our experts will be talking about the index quite a bit. So just quickly on the purpose and role of peer review, we look at this as a supportive effort for states. We want to support states in meeting those statutory requirements in Title I. We want to support states in developing and implementing valid and reliable and coherent state assessment systems. It's meant to promote the documentation of technical quality so that states may apply assessment results in a manner that's consistent with professional standards. That, in a nutshell, are the four big reasons for assessment peer review. So my slides don't look like that slide, so I apologize for that, but we've got some scrunching on the screen. So the updated guide reflects those changes in the ESEA that came about with the passage of ESSA. For the most part, the academic assessment provisions, and so we use that now that we're talking about ELP, we'll use the phrase academic assessments, which is reading, language, arts, mathematics, and science. But it's easier to say academic than it is to say those three things every time. Are largely unchanged. As I mentioned, ELP assessments are now required under Title I, and the requirements are integrated because they very closely parallel the academic assessment requirements. And the guide will be in effect for assessments that were administered in the 2017-18 school year. That was the first year that our assessment regulations under the statute took place. So it will, moving forward, address, this will be the guide. We've replaced the guide that we had. We have, in the last year of issuing peer review determinations to states, tried to review, based on the evidence we had, several of the new ESSA requirements on the academic And so you'll see a reference in some of the state letters that have come out since really the first of the year that reference an ESSA requirement or two. For those that got determinations on alternate assessments, they learned of a new requirement that we put into those state determinations. We will have a plenary session tomorrow afternoon that talks only about that. All right? So, so we did start implementing the ESSA requirements as we could when we had evidence from a state. And in most cases, states were able to meet the ESSA requirements we were focusing on. So we want to take a moment. What's going to be the similar critical elements and structure? It's an evidence-based process. We use independent experts to make recommendations. We have a submission process and evidence documentation with some type of index that links and explains the evidence that's submitted. We get feedback from the experts in what we call the peer review notes and the outcome letter from the department, which is the official determination. One thing, just as a side note, how many people know how to find the peer review determination letter page that we have? Okay, less than half. So we need to make a note to post that link so that you can find it. One thing we have started doing with we've gone back to the 2016 cycle of peer review. We are now appending the peer review notes to every state determination letter as we publish them. So previously, peer review notes were shared with states. They weren't publicly available unless folks went to a state, but we've taken the step to make them available at the time we send the letter to the state, the final letter. Then we send the peer review notes. So that's a fun fact if you want to. I will warn you, don't print them out, because a state letter would typically be 4 pages or so. With the peer review notes appended, and it can be up over 100 pages. So just don't hit print unless you're prepared to do that. So the requirements for changes to assessment systems, which trigger when you'd have to undergo peer review again, are very similar. So those are some things in the peer review process that have not changed. Just a note on what needs to be peer reviewed. So general mathematics and reading language arts for grades 3 through 8, and at least once in grades 9 through 12. General science implemented at least once in each of these grade spans, 3, 5, 6, 9, and 10, 12. Alternate assessments in those 3 subject areas for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities for the grades that are described above. So everywhere there's a general assessment, there has to be an alternate assessment. So then none of those are new requirements. What is new are English language proficiency assessments for all English learners in grades K through 12, and alternate ELP assessments for English learners with the most significant cognitive disabilities in grades K through 12. There are new flexibilities in the ESSA in the area of assessment, and with those flexibilities, in certain situations, peer review requirements apply. They are, if applicable, if a state chooses to allow the use of locally selected, nationally recognized high school academic assessments, there are specific peer review requirements for that. If states utilize the flexibility of 8th grade, what we call the 8th grade math exception, where the 8th grader takes a high school test in 8th grade in lieu of their 8th grade math test, then that student is required to take a more advanced mathematics course once during high school. That test, the advanced high school test, also has a peer review requirement for states that use that flexibility. if applicable, student assessments that are given in a student's native language, and if applicable, content assessments in a Native American language. All right, so I'm going to hand it off to my partner, Deborah, and do you want the laptop? You bringing yours up?
Either way. You want to leave?
Okay, yeah, that's probably easier.
Okay, good morning. For this section, we're going to talk about the new, let's see. Okay, the new ESSA requirements. I will say they are new, but they're not that new actually anymore. It's been actually a couple of years. So, and I will note that we have walked through these in other presentations. So if you've heard this already, just consider this a refresher. We're not going to go into a lot of detail. The new guide, I think, does a pretty nice job in the what we call the front matter of sort of laying out these big new requirements. So we just wanted to kind of call them to your attention. But of course, if you have any questions about anything that I talk about, you know, I'll direct you to the regulatory or statutory language, which is the language you should follow. So this first slide is just an overview of kind of, you know, some of the big things that are new. One is that there is a meaningful consultation requirement in a state's development and adoption of standards. We mean that to be going forward, so there's a note in the guide about what that applies to. It doesn't mean you have to go back to your 2005 adoption of standards necessarily and look for this. Another thing is universal design for learning in assessment design. Another big new change is equal benefits for students taking assessments with accommodations. And we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. Alternate academic achievement standards aligned with post-secondary education or employment. And this last one I know does impact some states. Assessments may be partially delivered in the form of portfolios, projects, or extended performance tasks. And that means they may not be completely delivered as portfolio, project, or extended performance tasks. So Don already talked about, obviously, these ELP requirements. Not all ELP requirements are new. It certainly is new to peer review. But so ELP assessments are now part of our peer review requirements. And Don talked about, you know, they are integrated throughout the critical elements, so you would need to look at all the critical elements to see where the ELP requirements apply. And we are going to talk a little bit more about next steps. We do intend to do an ELP peer review in 2019, and we'll talk more about when we think that'll be. English learners with disabilities must be provided accommodations on the ELP assessment, so students are afforded an opportunity to demonstrate what they know and can do. A state must develop an alternate ELP assessment for ELs with the most significant cognitive disabilities. And a state may choose to implement an alternate ELP assessment aligned with grade level and grade band achievement standards, or it may choose to implement an ELP aligned with alternate ELP achievement standards that the state has the option to develop. That's kind of a mouthful. I am going to mostly read these slides, and the reason is because the wording of this language is very important, so if I sort of try to paraphrase, I'm likely to maybe change the requirement, and I don't want to do that. States must provide appropriate accommodations for English learners, and if an English learner has a disability that precludes assessment in one or more of the domains of the ELP assessment, such that they're, oh,
Change that slide.
okay, thank you. Okay. Okay. Such that there are no appropriate accommodations for the affected domain, the states must assess the student's English language proficiency based on the remaining domains that are possible to assess the student. Okay, so just like with our regular assessment peer review, a lot of you are part of consortia that, so, you know, as for your ELP assessments. And so we're going to handle that pretty similarly to the way we have handled consortia for the general peer review. So this is not going to be new, but definitely, you know, you can always ask us about this, how it'll work for your state. So if there's a consortium, they will be able to submit common evidence for a group of states, and one peer review panel will look at that evidence. There will always be some state-specific items, just like with the general peer review. There will be state-specific items that each state needs to address. And the map to the critical elements, Don's going to show this a little bit more in his part, but we have a graphic that talks about which things are most likely to be provided by the consortium as common evidence across states and which evidence should be state provided. And I will say that the more we work with that, the more we see that there's a lot of crossover. So just, you know, as a state, what you would be asking yourself is, okay, is the consortium addressing this or not? And if they're not, then it's your responsibility to. And as a state, do you have something you can add to what the consortium is already providing? So those are just things to think about. New requirements for students with disabilities. If a state administers an alternate assessment in an academic content area for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities, the alternate assessment must be aligned with the state's academic content standards for the grade in which the student is enrolled and yield results relative to the state's alternate academic achievement standards. A state's alternate academic achievement standards must reflect professional judgment as to the highest possible standards achievable by such students and be designed to ensure that a student who meets those standards is on track to pursue post-secondary education or competitive integrated employment. That part that's kind of bolded is new. We also know that it's something states are thinking about. You know, we will be working with you to talk more about that requirement. You know, it may not be something that you automatically know how to address at this point, and we are, you know, we'll be working with you on that. Okay. This is really important. A state must ensure that accommodations for all required assessments do not deny students with disabilities or English learners the opportunity to participate in the assessment and any benefits from participation in the assessment. A state must, to the extent practicable, incorporate principles of universal design for learning, and ESSA prohibits a state from precluding students with the most significant cognitive disabilities who take an alternate assessment from attempting to complete requirements for a regular high school diploma. Some new requirements for assessing English learners. Appropriate accommodations for English learners, similar to the previous slide, may not deny them the opportunity to participate in the assessment or any of the benefits afforded to other students who are not English learners. To the extent practicable, academic content assessments must be administered in the language and form most likely to yield accurate and reliable information on what ELs know and can do in order to determine the student's mastery of skills in academic content areas until the students have achieved English proficiency. So this part of the statute, this is not a requirement, this is optional. The locally selected, nationally recognized assessment. We will have a breakout session that'll go into more detail about this. We have a link here that goes to a memo that we put out in 2017 that basically lays out the requirements. What I will say is if your state is thinking about this, we do encourage you to give us a call and let's talk through the requirements. We've done that with several states, and so we definitely want to know if you're in a state that you're thinking about this, because there are pretty specific requirements, and they need to happen in a certain order, and so we do want to talk with you about that. So this memo does lay out the things that a state needs to do if they want to go down this route, and again, it's optional, but the state itself would establish technical criteria. They would need to show comparability of the locally selected, nationally recognized high school academic assessments, and they will need to submit those assessments for peer review. And then they will need to monitor the districts that are using those assessments. And there are parental notification requirements, and this is important. It's the flexibility here is that an LEA may choose one of these assessments, based on the state's requirements, but the whole LEA has to use that assessment. It's not that every school gets to pick and choose. Okay, so a few more additional requirements. A state must demonstrate that its challenging academic standards are aligned with entrance requirements for credit-bearing coursework in the system of public higher education in the state and relevant state career and technical education standards. And this was the consultation requirement I referred to earlier. A state must conduct meaningful and timely consultation with stakeholders when developing the challenging academic standards and assessment systems and the ELP standards and assessment systems. And what we've said is that only applies to standards and assessments adopted after the passage of ESSA in 2015. We have been looking, like Don said, we've been looking at states when they've been coming in for peer review. And most states, you're doing this already, but we do want to call it to your attention. And there is a new critical element in the guide. It's one of the few rare new critical elements, but there is a critical element that addresses this. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it back over to Don.
So the guide is organized in a pretty functional way, we think. There's what we call the front matter, and then there's a section about the critical elements. The front matter, we have a pretty nice digest of all of the ESSA changes that include regulatory citations for those who just have to know those things. There's a description of the peer review process. There's some guide ideas about preparing the peer review submission. There's this section that we've mentioned about when assessments must be peer reviewed, and there's a section on terminology. And it is structured as a guide, but one thing that I have told people is that, especially the part about the peer review process, it's not a long, it might only be a page and a half, but if you read through that, because sometimes when we interact with states, I get the sense that there's a perception that the peer review, there's like this thing behind the curtain and nobody understands how it works. Well, that page or so in the guide that talks about the peer review, that's really how it works. And if you run into a peer reviewer here and you ask them, mostly they will, I'm sure they will say, that's really how it works. There aren't any secrets, except obviously we protect the anonymity of who's doing the peer review on your state. But beyond that, I think, are pretty transparent about how we do this work. And the guide and the critical elements are the rubric, if you will, that help the peer reviewers record their peer notes. So we just want to, that is really how the process moves forward. And then we have the section on the critical elements, and the critical elements contain a 2-column format, which we'll get to in a second, but there's requirements on the left-hand side and examples of supporting evidence that states might consider submitting on the right-hand side. And then they're organized into now 7 sections. Previously there were 6 sections, but there's a 7th section that was necessary for one particular flexibility under the ESSA. So when do you have to bring in a test for peer review as a state? So if you have a new assessment, whether or not you've changed your state content standards, but if you have a new assessment, you almost assuredly need to have a peer review. Now, there is the case, what if I change vendors, but my blueprint, nothing changes about the specifications for my assessment. The achievement standards are the same, and so forth. That's different, but that's not really a new assessment, that's a new vendor. So, now, all of these examples depend a little bit, and the guide gives a bit more detailed description, but the development of a technology-based version of an existing assessment may require peer review. It depends. The development of a native language version of an assessment may require peer review. Changes to an existing test design, and that one is, in all of these cases, please consult with us and we'll think through. It has to do with the magnitude of the change that you're making. If you're shifting 4 multiple choice items into a couple of constructed response items in your blueprint, I don't think that generally necessitates a change, or a peer review, I mean. But if you're doing a much larger format change, then it could well require another peer review. Changes to the test administration, and this may overlap with changes in technology-based assessment, may require peer review. Assessments that are based on new academic achievement standards or new ELP achievement standards. In other words, you've set different cut scores for the same test. That will require at least some additional peer review of that part of the critical elements. And so the guide kind of says, well, some of these are only these sections in the peer. It's not a full peer review, it's a partial peer review. Assessment, when you change your academic content standards in a state, or if you change your English language proficiency standards, then that will necessitate a peer review because you will have to change your assessment to line up with those changed standards. If you're taking advantage of the flexibility and allowing locally selected, nationally recognized high school academic assessments in place of the state high school assessment, that will necessitate a peer review. Okay? So those are the primary categories, and it's again fleshed out in more detail, and that's something we really want to be there with you, thinking through and coming to a determination. Yeah, you probably have to peer review, or no, you don't. I did want to mention the use of a term on the previous slide. Let me back up. I don't know if I know how to back this up. Oh, there. Yeah. So we use the phrase ELP achievement standards. I don't know that that was a term used in the field a lot, but as we started to work on the guide, ELP standards are of a nature that they're different than academic content standards, and we had to think of something to call them. So we're calling them ELP achievement standards, but they are the cut scores for the ELP assessment. But we did want to mention that. I don't know if we invented the term or not, but we knew we needed something, and it sounds better than cut scores. So, our map of critical elements are here. There's now a section 7. Previously, we had 6 sections. The 6 sections are all organized thematically the same way as the previous guide. The 7th section deals with the requirements that are specific to locally selected, nationally recognized high school tests. And so when those states that are allowing that flexibility have peer review, they have to address evidence for the 6 sections plus section 7. But for any other peer review that hits any other category, section 7 does not apply. And so this is the same graphic, and what we've done is we've just highlighted section 7, which is completely new, and we changed in section 1 the critical element 1.5, which dealt with participation rates, and we made the decision we monitor and collect data on all state participation rates through this consolidated state performance report. So we have every state's participation rate. So we thought, and we had a new requirement for meaningful consultation. So we replaced the old 1.5 with critical element 1.5, now called meaningful consultation. For standards development, as Deborah noted, that we have a timeline based upon when ESSA statute took effect, so it applies to standards that were adopted after that date moving forward. And we've got that line, I think, pretty well expressed in the guide. So this is something that we've mentioned, but we really want to draw it out. So this is Exhibit 3 in the guide. I forget what page it's on. This is our suggestion how most consortia might consider organizing their evidence as what critical elements are most likely addressed by the state in preparing the submission, and which critical elements are most likely addressed by a consortium or some other group organization that's sponsoring a test used in many states. And then we've got a category called hybrid evidence, where there's going to be a lot of overlap. And what we want to emphasize is this is a good starting point, but each consortium submission may take its own length or direction, perspective, and may choose to assign responsibility or sources of evidence differently. We certainly welcome that. We've literally had conversation with states that said, well, your guide says it has to be like this, but that's not the way that we're doing it in our state. And so we say, well, then that's not the way you do it in your state. Just put the evidence together in such a way that it's clear. Because when we do consortia peer review, they are a little bit of a special animal, because we have a consortium. We pull together a panel of reviewers who look at the common evidence, the evidence that is common in many states, and they write up observations first, and then we review individual states that have the complementary evidence that goes on top of, if you will, the state peer review. And so it's a little bit like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. We get a set of peer review notes from a consortium and a set of peer review notes for a member state, and we fit it together. The individual state peer reviewers get the peer review notes from the consortium panel, because we really need to achieve consistency for everyone. So because of that, it is important that states and consortia together understand who's responsible for what, so that there's not an unpleasant surprise when peer review recommendations and findings come back to a state and a state thought that the consortium was submitting something, but it did not, and so that leaves a gap. So again, just, I think, communicate early and often about organizing these common assessment peer review submissions. And we've had the practice of working with states that are using common assessments, and we have conference calls and kind of help talk through it. So we have done that, and we will continue to do that if that's helpful. But we want to mention that this is a guide. It is a guide. It is not, cut in stone. So just a note about, I've got a couple of pullouts from some of the critical elements. We've mentioned integrating the ELP requirements alongside the academic assessment requirements. And when we did that, it makes some of these critical element displays pretty long. And we had to think of a way to organize the information so that it's clear if we're talking about academic assessments, we mean this, and if we're talking about ELP assessments, we mean that. And so we just used a simple formatting convention where we boldface and italicize ELP-specific references, and we boldface and underline academic assessment references. And if it's in plain text and there's no distinguish, then you have to assume that it's applying to both. So that's the convention that we took in organizing the requirements. So we do that in the requirements on the left-hand side, and we do the same thing in suggested examples of evidence on the right-hand side. So I don't know that it's super sophisticated. In fact, it's not super sophisticated, but we do think it's clear. As clear as we can make it, and maintaining an integrated approach. The other way would have been to have two separate sections, and I've told you that story already. So we think we did the right thing by integrating it. So that's a little bit. One last note on the peer, for those who have gotten peer review notes back in states, there's what we call the footnote on every page of peer review notes, and it's longer than what's here, but, oh, I'm sorry. Oh. So this is the footnote that I'm talking about. Our peer notes inform the Secretary's consideration of state assessment systems, but the department makes the final decision. In other words, peer reviewers make recommendations to the department. You'll see that what those recommendations are in the peer notes. Those are unadulterated. However, the final determination may be a little different in that we may not follow through on a peer reviewer's recommendation about a state submitting more evidence, and we may feel that it's sufficient, or we may feel that the peer reviewer recommendation overlooked something, and so we feel that we want to call that out to that state. That will happen. I think there's good consistency, but it's not 100% consistency. So one thing that we do, and we spend a lot of time doing this, is we carefully try to norm our determinations across all of the peer reviews that we're doing to sort of equalize. We have different group of peer reviewers writing recommendations, so we at the department try to square that up. But that is something that you'll see on peer review notes, and if you wonder why that is on there, it's because we want to have a constant reminder for folks of that fact. So I think I'm handing this back to you at this point, right?
Okay, so we just wanted to finish with a little bit of a status update, tell you what we've been doing and what we will be doing. We mentioned, and many of you probably know this, but I do know there were a lot of hands were raised when Patrick asked about people who are new in their assessment positions. So we did start peer review back up in 2016. We were doing it before, but then we took a few years off. So in 2016, we reviewed most of your states, 38 states. The ones that were ready to come back to us in 2017, we did a review of 11 states. And in 2018, in February and March, we reviewed 42 states. Most of you know that there are 4 possible outcome categories, and these are by assessment. So they're not, the state doesn't get one outcome, it's per assessment. And here is our link to the website. See, Don, you did have this. This is the website where the letters are posted. You're going to have an electronic copy of these slides on our website. Of course, we can always give you this link. It is a little challenging to find. So that's where the letters are posted, and they're posted for every state by state. We have had several states that have met all the requirements for at least one assessment, so that's a nice thing. And so this last line here, this is for the 2018 peer review that we did of 42 states. We realized that, and I'm going to say it's now 27 and not 28, so that's a nice thing. But we realize that 27 of you are still expecting your outcome letters, and we actually will help if I go to the next slide. I just want to share with you that we are working as quickly as we can. Most of you know we've had phone calls with you. We've given you the peer review notes. We've asked for your input. We've asked for, additional evidence in some places where we think you can meet something, but maybe the evidence wasn't given to us. What that means, though, is that taking all that into account, we're looking at, in most states, we're looking at several assessments. Some of them came to us in 2016, so we're looking at several sets of peer reviews for those assessments, where here's what was done in 2016, here's what was done in 2018. A lot of you are part of multiple consortia. So we are, Don mentioned it's kind of a jigsaw puzzle, and I would say, what I will tell you, for those of you who are still waiting, is we really look at every state and we put all that together. And it is taking us a little bit of time. So, but we feel like it's more important to be conversing with you and to have some back and forth, and that means this takes more time. But we are working on it, and what we want to get you is the best possible product. So that's just my note on that. There's a couple of these maps, and this one is for the general assessments, and then I'll show you one for the alternate assessments. This just to give you a sense of kind of every state being in a very different place. We have states that came in 2016, many of them. We have states that came in 2016 plus 2017. Some states came to us new in 2017, some new, a couple new in 2018. We have now looked at every state, and we've looked at multiple assessments for every state. And we do know that you're making changes, and we encourage you to, let us know when those changes are coming up. We really want to know that when we go into the next general peer review, we want to know where you're at with your assessments. So we will keep asking you that. I think every time we get on the phone with you, we say, hey, what's new with your assessments? And we do want to know. So anyway, this is just to show you where states are at in terms of in these different places with the general assessment. And then this is what the alternate assessment looks like. So again, it's just states have come into us multiple times and in different years, and they're in different places. This, you're not going to be able to really see what this tells you, but it's basically a look at how many states sort of have met requirements for something, substantially met, partially met, or not met. And the not mets are really rare. The mets are a little bit rare too, but we're working, we're seeing more of those all the time. Most states are falling into the substantially met category, especially if they've been through a couple of peer reviews, then you have a better sense of what's needed. So we're definitely in the substantially met category for most states on these things, particularly the English language arts and the math general assessments. The what's coming up, which is probably what you're most interested in. We've got a meeting coming up. This won't apply to all of you, but it's our combined federal programs meeting in December. We will be doing another Innovative Assessment Demonstration Authority review this year. So you had the opportunity to apply last year, but you will have another opportunity to apply. If you have questions about that, what I'll say is this is on our information about the Innovative Assessment Demonstration Authority is on our website. We do have an application that we used last year, and it will be nearly the same this year, so folks can look at that if they're thinking about it, and of course, ask us any questions. We do think that the first ELP peer review is going to be in spring 2019. So definitely be thinking about that. That will not include alternate ELPs, but we hope to do that the following year.
Unless they're ready.
Unless they're ready. So we have been asked, if you have an alternate English language proficiency assessment that can be peer reviewed, yes, then we would be interested in looking at that. Something that's new, we did get a small amount of funding in 2019 for competitive assessment grants. That's a new thing in ESSA. It takes the place of our enhanced assessment grant program. It's not the same, but it's similar and it will be competitive, so you will be hearing more about that. We think that the next general and alternate assessment peer review, and by general I mean not ELP, will be in summer 2019. So you're good until about spring 2019 in terms of needing to submit or resubmit evidence for your general academic assessments. And then again, the alternate ELP peer review will be 2020 unless you have one that's ready earlier. And then, then we think we'll be on a semi-annual cycle. Okay.
Are we scheduled until 10:45 or 10:30?
10:45.
10:45, okay.
So we've held off on questions until now. We do have 2 standing mics, and I know that those are probably a little challenging to get to. So maybe you could stand up and yell, and we'll try to repeat questions. I know those won't come out well on video, but we'll do what we can.
Might as well sit down if they're going to ask a question.
Okay. Does anyone have questions for us? Vince?
Yeah, and I don't know if you went through, you went pretty quickly, with the spring ELP assessment, that submission would be due to you by the end of this calendar year? Or did you say that? I missed that.
We did not say that strategically, but we are thinking in talking with some folks at the NCSA in San Diego from at least one of the ELP consortia, we thought about the end of the year, but I think we're now thinking the end of March is what was shared as a reasonable target, given what the work is in compiling the evidence and our delay in getting the guide out to the field until July 1st, basically. So given that, we're looking at, kind of a March submission of evidence, and then in the spring we'd peer review. We don't have an exact date. I think we'll negotiate that with folks if they're ready to submit it at the end of February, then we would probably want it by then.
Well, and we generally need about 6 weeks
Yeah.
from when we get your submission to, to give the peer
Yeah.
reviewers time to look at it, so.
Right. So, I mean, one thing, just so you know what our lead time is, we generally need about 5 months prior to a peer review for us to properly get panels of peer reviewers put together and vetted for, it takes a while, and then we have to plan the logistics. So we are always thinking like 6 months ahead. So the state is obviously furiously doing the work to compile the evidence and get it ready. And we try to be a little flexible. We'll have states that say, I can't make this deadline, can I make that deadline? And within reason, we bend unofficially on a deadline a time or two. Although we do think that the electronic submission process we now have cuts out a lot of time that used to be with the paper-based submission method. So it makes it easier on the states, it makes it easier on us and our reviewers as well. So that was a good question. Any other questions? If there aren't questions, I want to give a little bit of an introduction and have Deb share her project with us. So we mentioned that I need that. We're going to figure this out before the end of the. So we had asked our technical assistance partners at the Center for Standards and Assessment Implementation to think about a project for the benefit of states that really focused on best practices in online testing administration. And what was on our mind were some things we'd been seeing in peer review, feedback we'd be providing to states, in thinking in the last 4 years, some adverse events that have happened in states with online testing. And so what we thought was maybe there's a resource that can be provided for states to refer to. And so they agreed to try to pull something together. And so in developing that, Deb has asked for some time to give a plug for their work to date and actually use this gathering of nearly all the states to offer opportunities for feedback in the next 2 days to see if their thinking on this is the right thinking, or if there's now is a time to change the direction of where they go with this. So that's really what I'm going to ask Deb to kind of come up and have a few remarks. Yeah, there's steps on that side. It's important if you're a reviewer and you're on the stage that you learn what Deb, because you can't see once you're up here, so.
Yeah. Wow.
All right.
Just the big green button.
Press the big, yeah.
All right.
Are you going to refer to this?
I am.
So why don't you tell me and I'll hit the big green button when the time comes, and that you can just.
That's all right. I can do two
Okay.
things at once.
Well, I can't, so.
I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
Good morning. I'm Deb Sigmund, and I work for WestEd, which is proud to house one of the federal content technical assistance centers, the Center on Standards and Assessment Implementation. I serve as a senior advisor, emphasis on advisor, not senior. And I am here with my colleague, Dr. Andy Latham, who serves as the director of the center. Just as for full disclosure, prior to my role at WestEd, I served in a West Coast state, the state of California, as the state assessment director for a number of years, and then as the deputy superintendent, overseeing mostly assessment and accountability issues. So I have been through peer review. It's always a lovely experience. I know that you all have warm feelings about peer review. So this is a great project that the department has asked us to undertake. And as Don indicated, it really is about helping states think about best practices, in particular for online administration. So we have put together what we think is an outline that would be helpful for you all, based on some input from the department, as well as just talking to a couple of folks around the country. But we really would love to have your input. So the idea, oh, I see you have to do both. Got it. So the idea is to develop this best practice guide for mostly state assessment directors as you think about putting your submission together. There's a lot of submissions coming forward, and so we think that this would be helpful. We're focusing on aspects of test administration, most notably online test administration. But there are some other things that we would be thinking about as well. And so here are some of the topics that we're thinking about: preparing for test administration, the technology infrastructure. I know that in the state of California, I was the deputy at the time, that we decided to move to online in about 9 months. And we wanted to do it. We knew that it would be difficult, but that was kind of the tack that we took. So needless to say, there's lots to consider in terms of that infrastructure that you have in place around your states. Test security continues to be a major issue for all of our states. Communicating to your districts, to your LEAs, and then on to schools, as well as to classroom teachers doing the administration. Monitoring test irregularities, finding an appropriate way to monitor those and to ensure that they are being appropriately determined, and then documenting all of those. So that's kind of where, those are the topics that we are landing on. But as Don indicated, this is a project we hope to have it finished around the beginning of the year, and so we want to take this opportunity to really think about what would be best for you all. We also, we want to prepare this as you think about informing your discussions about when you put out new requests for proposals, or conversations with your current or future assessment vendors about what are the right questions to ask. What are the things, pardon me, that you need to be concerned about, or that you'd like your assessment vendors to be concerned about? And then as part of this, we would curate research best practices and include state examples in those practices and applicable resources. So this is what our request is. We are asking for your feedback. Now, you all have 2 days of a very rich program planned with lots of wonderful experts and folks around the states to help you think about peer review. So we know that we're probably not going to be your first stop, but we are going to be available. We're going to be available in this room. And after talking with Don and Deborah, we think it'd be best, we'll kind of position ourselves around the last 15 minutes of each of the breakout sessions. That is not to say that we would want you to leave if you're actively engaged in a session, but if in fact you have multiple team members from your state, if you could send one down, and we have a couple of questions that we'd love to ask you to think about. Are these the right topics? What would you like to hear about? Where's the capacity needed in your state that this best practice guide might come in really handy? So if in fact we're going to continue to collect feedback, so we're going to do some targeted interviews of the folks in this room, including state assessment directors, and then continue to collect that with a draft resource guide, probably at the end of December, with the final, as I said, at the beginning of the year. We'll also be here probably toward the end of lunch, right, Andy? Yeah. So we'll just kind of, we'll plant ourselves here. Would love to talk to you. It'll be very informal, but we really want to make this a tool for you. And the best way to do that is to seek your input and feedback. Anything else? I think that's it. All right. Thank you both.